Good morning, everybody. Thank you for asking me to come and speak. Another disclaimer and an apology to start with. So the disclaimer is that I've done this talk 2 or 3 times before, so if you've heard it, I apologise. You're going to hear it all again, but hopefully, with around about 90 days to go, it might serve as a good refresher or a check-in for where you're at in the process of getting ready for GDPR. Also, I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not giving legal advice, so I'll just make that point at the beginning. And as Martin said, these are kind of my views. They're not absolute, and one of the things that will come apparent throughout the day is there are lots of things about GDPR that need you and require you to kind of take a stand and a view on where you sit on it. To do that, to take a stand with confidence, you need quite a good bit of information and background around what are the parameters in which you're doing that, and I think that's what we're here to try and do today. What I'm going to talk about is I think, probably a quicker overview of what's going to follow it throughout the rest of the day. GDPR is a huge document. In fact, I don't know if it is a document. I've never seen it as a document. I've seen it online as a digital document, for want of a better word. But that in itself shows how things have changed. So Martin talked about how under the old regime everything existed on paper, and lots of things it might refer to might have been talking about Rolodexes and where data is stored in those terms. I think when the last data protection legislation came in, Mark Zuckerberg was 11 years old. Social media was a term that people hadn't used before in the context that we understand it now. So the way that data flows and is used throughout the world and people's personal information throughout the world has completely changed, which is why we need the new regulation to bring us fully up to date. And in fact, it's probably slightly ahead of where we are technologically now, anticipating where we're going to be going in the future. So there's a lot to it. Necessarily, what I'm going to do is an overview of that to try and cut it down into some of the most salient points. So I'm going to talk a little bit about GDPR, what it is and why it's different to the former regimes. I'm going to talk about some of the things that I think are the key practical outcomes that arts organisations need to think about in terms of compliance, and then at the end I'm just going to think about how can you as organisations go through a process to make sure that you can attack this mountain face, or these 4 letters that are kind of causing consternation across the across the country in all sorts of sectors in a sensible and achievable way, which I absolutely think that you can do. And I think there'll be a little bit of time, hopefully, at the end of my bit to ask questions. But then there's the panel session later on if you have further questions at that point. So the first point to make is GDPR is not coming. May the 25th is not the point at which GDPR comes law. It's already law. It's been law since April 2016, and we're now in a transition period where we're supposed to be getting ready. So a quick show of hands around the room. How many people are completely ready for GDPR? Perfect. That's the answer that I thought that we would get, and is no surprise, because everybody is working through this process now, and people are at different stages along the way of readiness. Some people are just starting, some people have got quite a long way and are nearly there, and everywhere in between those two things. So it's good that you're all here and kind of checking in on what you need to do. But we have this limited period of time in which to get ready. The reason that you do need to do that now, you absolutely need to think about getting ready now and not leave it till the 25th of May, is because from that point in time, the law that is applied by the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, if you come to their notice and they need to apply the law to you, at that point they'll be doing so under GDPR, not under data protection as they would be at the moment. So there are things like increased fines that you would need to be wary of, and there's been lots of that in the press and scary numbers, but treat those with a little bit of caution, because they are for the absolute worst infringements of using data of the most sensitive kinds in the most heinous ways. Will receive those fines of the magnitude that you've read about in the press. But nonetheless, they do have the ability to levy much greater fines. Organisations are responsible for demonstrating their compliance, and it will be done against GDPR from that point forward. 25th of May is also my son's 6th birthday, so I prefer to think of GDPR Day as William's birthday and not GDPR Day. Life will go on around GDPR on the 25th of May and after it, so kind of bear that in mind as we go through it as well. There's a really fun, one of the things about GDPR is that we'll see how the principles of it change in comparison to the former legislation, but one of the things that's really fundamental to it is a change of approach. Before GDPR, people used to kind of say things like, well, if we do X, can we get away with Y? And will the law enable us to do that? And what GDPR requires is a completely different approach, which is data protection by design. So you start off from the question of, if I want to achieve X, what do I have to do in order to be able to do that compliantly? And how do I manage the data that I'm going to need in order to be able to achieve that thing? Not, if I do this thing, can I do something else? It's a complete change of approach to make sure that data protection is absolutely integral to the way that you think and work. It's not just about ticketing data. GDPR applies to all personal information, and personal information is any information which applies to or identifies a natural person under GDPR. So it can still be lists of names and addresses on Rolodexes. It can be names and addresses in spreadsheets or mailing lists. It can be stuff in a ticketing system. It can be a gift aid donation on bits. It can be anything and anywhere that identifies people. So you really need to think about that as well. And as I say, you need to get ready now, because if, for example, just as an example, if you rely on consent as the basis on which you process data, if the consents that you have got from people are not compliant, you haven't collected them in a way which is compliant, and you can demonstrate that from the 25th of May onwards, you can no longer use that data. Okay, or you're liable to prosecution if you do, and you can't demonstrate that you have collected it in a way which is compliant compared to how you're going to use it. So if it's not compliant, you need to think about how you get it compliant, and you've got 3 months left to do that. So that's why you need to start thinking now, if you're not already, and I'm sure many of you are, a long way along that process. So how does it differ? So these are the principles of GDPR. The first 6 of them are pretty much the same as they were under data protection regulation. The one that makes the massive difference, and that means you cannot at all ignore it and do nothing about it, is the 7th principle of accountability. And you must be able to demonstrate how you are compliant. So formally, as long as you did the right things, that was kind of okay. Now, if you come to the attention of the ICO and they investigate you because somebody's made some kind of a complaint, you have to have a really robust way of demonstrating why what you're doing is okay. We've thought about it, we've done a privacy impact assessment, we've got a policy that's documented here, and that's why we believe what we're doing is okay. Now, if you've done that, I would guess, and it's intimated from the ICO, that you will be treated much better than you will if you haven't gone along that route. You're liable to face fines and action if you haven't, at least if you can't evidence that you've gone along this process of embracing your ability to think about and demonstrate how you are acting in compliance with the regulations. So the key changes, these are, in my view, some of the key changes about GDPR and why it's different to the former data protection legislation. So there's that accountability one first. There's also expanded individuals' rights. So data subjects, we have expanded rights about what we can expect from people who hold our personal information. And those rights are around things like the right to be informed, what a data controller is going to do with our information, clearly. So we can't bury what we're going to do in pages and pages of terms and conditions and think that that's going to be okay for us to be able to do whatever we want because nobody's going to read down to the bottom of it. Just as, again, another show of hands, can everybody put their hand up in the room if you've ever downloaded an app onto your mobile phone or your tablet or so show of hands, anyone, any app? Keep your hands in the air if you've ever read from start to finish the terms and conditions that they asked you to read when you signed up. So 1 or 2 hands in the room. In the past, what I've done is I have copy and pasted some of those terms and conditions into a Word document to measure how long they are. And that can vary between something like 300 or 400 words up to 6,000, 10,000 words, and it's no wonder that nobody reads them, because why would you? But we're not going to be allowed to do that anymore. We just have to be much more transparent. And the reason that you have to be more transparent is because what you do, if you come to the point of investigation, what you do has to be within the understanding, or at least the reasonable expectations of a data subject. And if you haven't told them why you've got the data and what they're doing with it, then it's very likely that what you're doing is not going to be within their reasonable expectations. So those expanded rights also include things like the right to have incorrect data corrected. They have the right to access any data that you hold on them, and you're no longer allowed to charge for that. You used to be able to charge £10 under Data Protection Act. You have to provide that information more quickly. People have a right to be deleted from your database if they ask to be so deleted. We'll come on to this a bit later on. The right to be deleted isn't an automatic right. So in that case, you would say, why do you want to be deleted? Can we serve the purpose that you want to be deleted in another way? Can we suppress your records so that we don't mail you or contact you or cause you an irritation in another way? Because you might have a really, really legitimate reason for hanging on to and processing that record. So gift aid is a good example. You would need somebody's information to be able for gift aid monitoring and accounting purposes. You know who has given you that consent. So there's this range of rights that people have, and we'll come to some of those as we carry on through the day. There are limitations on automatic profiling. This has caused lots of consternation and worry about people. We can't profile data sets anymore. We can't mosaic profile or use Acorn or Spectrum or any of these kind of systems to add data. We can't do wealth screening. We can't, that may or may not be true. It depends on the context in which you're doing it, the information that the data subject has had, and what the impact and the outcome of what you're doing it for is concerned. So we'll talk about automated processing a little bit further when we come through as well. You need to be really, really clear, as I said, unambiguous. Consent has to be freely given, and we'll talk about how that hasn't always been the case in the past, when we come to talk about consent a little bit more in a moment. It's incumbent on you to report breaches, so if your database or your network is hacked by somebody, you have to report that to the ICO, and then you have to decide when and how you let data subjects know and what the impact on them is going to have been. And you need to have thought about that before it happens, so that you can manage the data such that if there was a breach, the risk and impact on those individuals is minimised as far as it's humanly possible for you to do so. Data protection officers, organisations of a particular scale, local authorities, definitely other organisations of a particular scale, all organisations who do mass processing regularly of large data sets may have to appoint a data protection officer, but everybody has to have somebody in the organisation who is responsible for the role that a data protection officer would play. And privacy impact assessments, the last thing, are going to be a key integral part of what everybody has to do. So when I talked about if you get investigated being able to demonstrate, one of the key ways in which you can demonstrate your compliance is if you've done privacy impact assessment, which shows what information you've got, why you want to use it, what the legal basis is for you doing that, what the risks are to the individual and you as an organisation, and what you're doing to mitigate those risks and make it okay. And then once you've done that risk assessment, you decide whether you can make that call to process the data in the way that you want to or not. So all of those things, I think, are some of the key changes. Why am I standing here talking about GDPR? As Martin said, back in 2015-2016, the Arts Council came up with the requirement of all of their funded organisations that they should share data between them. What caused some debate then, and now I think ongoingly still in some cases, is what does that mean? What does sharing data mean? What data? And can we actually legally do that? So Arts Council commissioned some guidance that was written by Roger Tomlinson, myself, and a lawyer called Adam Kerr around, can you share data, under what circumstances, and if it is appropriate for you to share personal information, how can you do that in compliance with the Act? So there's a website called Audience Data Sharing that we wrote, and as Martin said, the last part of that commission was for us to go and check in with the ICO about a year ago now to say, so that stuff that we talked to you about and the guidance that we wrote, this new thing, GDPR, is everything still okay under that? And they said, well, probably not actually. Some of it changed. So we had to redraft a lot of the guidance because some of the things become much more specific. So what I thought was a nice little day trip to the ICO's office in Wilmslow to tick the box of and kind of have job done on a project became a whole new project. So we have now updated all that guidance on audience data sharing. But having looked into that question, and also how the audience agency manage the data that we are custodians of, we hold the audience finder data set, which is a national audience data set, and we, as custodians of that data set, it's entirely incumbent on us to make sure we're absolutely compliant with GDPR. So having looked into that and this data sharing thing, you can't look into one bit of GDPR without it crossing into every other bit. So that's why, as Martin said, that principally I've come at it from a data sharing perspective, but once you open the door, it leads you everywhere because everything's connected. So having been to the ICO and discussed how the guidance that we'd previously drafted changed things and the way that people need to act going forward, myself and Roger and Andrew came up with 8 things that we think are the principal ways that are practically going to impact pretty much most arts organisations. So I'm just going to go through what those 8 things are now. So the first one, sorry, where's my water? The first one is about consent and your ability to be able to demonstrate consent, where you use consent as your legal basis for processing. I'll just explain that. So the conditions for processing, there are a number of different conditions for processing data that you can rely on as the legal justification for you doing that. One of them is consent. They're all equal. None of them are more equal than others. There's consent. There's another one that I'm sure you've all heard of called legitimate interests. There's another one which is called the performance of a contract. So do you need this information to be able to fulfill a contract? If somebody buys a ticket from you and they do it online via email, you need their email address to be able to deliver the receipt and the ticket back to them. So in that case, you can process that information because you have to be able to complete the contract. And there are some other ones which we're less likely to rely on, like they're in the fundamental interest of the data subject or for the public good and so on. So there are a number of them, but they're less easily applicable to the sector that we work in. I think for most people working in the arts and cultural sector, consent, legitimate interests and performance of the contract are likely to be the main conditions for processing. If consent is your condition for processing, you have to be able to demonstrate, as I said, how you gained that consent, what the data subject consented to, and when, and how they indicated their consent. And you have to be really, really specific. And the consent has to be specific to the purpose for which you want to use it. So, I need this information to deliver the ticket via an email, or I need this information to send marketing communications, and we gain permission from that because somebody read the statement, can we have your email address so that we can send you information about our events and activities? Tick the box, yes. And if you can show that you've gone through that process and what somebody's agreed to and when they did it and how, then it's likely that you're compliant. But you have to be really, really quite specific about what you're using. If you do share data with another organisation, and it includes personal information, the organisation that you share that data with has to have all of that same information. So the first thing is that you have to have named consent to share the information with another third-party organisation. And when I say named consent, what I mean is you can't ask a question which goes something like, and I came across one of these last week, so they're still out there and it's still happening. We would like to share your information with other third-party organisations who we think you might be interested in hearing from. Or we would like to share your information with other touring companies who visited our venue, whose work you've booked to see. Those are not good enough, they're not compliant. You have to name the organisation that you're sharing so that me, Mr. Data Subject, can know who's got my information really, really clearly. And that changes fundamentally the practice for a lot of organisations in the consent that they're collecting at the moment and whether or not you can share that data with somebody else. As I speak these words and look across the room, I see lots of worried faces coming back at me going, oh my God, really? Is that right? It is this fundamental shift, and the idea about it is it's putting the control of the personal information back in the hands of you and me, the data subject. And this is a good thing. It's not something to be scared and frightened of, it's a good thing. Because if you ask me today, who has got my information? For what purpose? Anywhere? I have absolutely no idea. And this is about an attempt to try to redress that balance and put us back in control of the data that we have. It's also good for arts organisations from an audience development perspective. The audience agency, one of the things that we spend a lot of time working with organisations on is segmentation for marketing and audience development and fundraising, and looking at different ways and tools that you can build segments that enable people to talk to people who are, you know, with the right offer and the right language at the right time, so that they will be receptive to it. Now, the first way of building up the most effective segments that you can possibly do is to have a marketing list of people who want to hear from you about stuff that they know you're going to tell them about, or that they've asked for you to talk to them about. So this idea of nefariously gathering consent by burying it deep in the conditions of something, or saying, well, we'll talk about some examples of how people do that presently, to try and trick people into getting their consent. It doesn't help you in the long run. You're just annoying people. You know, you don't have my consent to email me. Why are you keeping emailing me? Do you think if you annoy me hard enough, I'll come to your show? It's unlikely. So having people who are responsive is actually going to increase the return on investment that you have with your marketing lists. So under GDPR, this is what consent is. It has to be freely given, specific, informed, and unambiguous. So that idea about being able to do it in around about 100 words really, really clearly is key. But there are loads of challenges to that, because you have to get consent for the purpose. Why do you want to use it? Is it marketing? Is it fundraising? Is it to send research? Is it for something else? The channels that you want to contact people with, so is it email, is it SMS, text, is it postal, how is it? And all of those things, and explaining that, and then what your data policy is in terms of what you're then going to do with that information, what you've got it and how you safeguard it and so on. Doing all of that in 100 words is really challenging. So what you need to do is give the essentials in really short, sharp, clear language, and then if you need to give more information, you can have a two-stage approach to it, where you point people towards your privacy policy if they're going to need something a bit fuller to understand what you want. But don't, again, make it 10,000 words worth of stuff that nobody's ever going to read. Keep your privacy policy as brief as you can. If you want some guidance on how to do this, a really good way of doing it is to look at some of the organisations that have been whacked recently by the ICO. So quite a good one is the British Heart Foundation. So everybody remember the story about a year ago about British Heart Foundation? They were fined by the ICO because they had been doing lots of things actually. They'd been wealth screening their data, they'd been teleappending data to teleappending records to data that people weren't expecting them to. They were data matching with third-party organisations who hadn't been absolutely nothing to do with the regime whatsoever, and it was just this kind of catalogue of breaches, and they were hit with quite a big fine by the ICO. If you go and look at their privacy policy now, which they've had to sharpen up in response to the action that was taken against them, it's a really good example of how you can, how you can present your privacy policy. So keep an eye on the news stories that come out, and follow what happens to those organisations afterwards, because they have to get their house in order pretty quickly. So, as an example of what we can't do anymore, if you, my colleague Andrew Thomas Googled this one, if you Google ship sign-up form, this is the one that comes up as the #1 result. And this is what you can't do anymore. So untick this box if you do not wish to receive relevant information and promotion. So we're already in untick if you do not. What does that mean? Sort of thing. And then the next one is tick this box if you do wish to receive relevant information and promotions by email. And you kind of go, so do I tick it? Do I not tick it? If I tick this box, what does that? I'm not really sure. I'm already not sure, and that's, what's going on with that. So just be really, really clear. And with electronic communications, which are governed by another piece of legislation actually, so there's this thing coming in called GDPR, but there's already an existing piece of legislation called PECA. Hands up if you know about PECA. Okay, 2, 3, 4, 5 hands around the room. PECA has been in force since 2011, and it is what you would be fined under if you use emails, mobile numbers for SMS, text messaging. That is the law that you should actually be applying to in relation to all electronic communications for the last 7 years. And it says that you have to get opt-in consent for any email communications that you send. So that's already there. It's going to be updated by the EU. So once we get past May the 25th and we all breathe a huge collective sigh of relief, we have to get ready for the new update of the privacy regulation that's going to be coming in probably the end of this year or early next year. So our work won't quite be done yet. But anyway, back to PECA. It says you have to get opt-in consent. There is an exception to PECA that we'll come on to in a minute, which is called a soft opt-in. So really, really think about simplifying the language and making sure that you get opt-in wherever you can. Opt-in is legally required in certain situations. Good practice says that you do opt-in all the time, wherever you can. Granularity of consent, we've already talked about this a bit. So it's this idea that you need to be specific about the purposes for which you're gathering data. So if you're selling tickets as an arts organisation and you want to contact people for marketing purposes around your shows and events is one purpose. If you have a fundraising team that want to contact people for fundraising purposes, that's another purpose. And you need to specifically get consent for that purpose. You also need granularity for the channels that you want to use. So we know you need opt-in consent for email or SMS or automated telephone calls. How you get that, you can be specific, but you don't have to bundle those things up all separately. So you could say in a single statement, we would like to contact you by email, telephone, and such, is that okay, and collect that information. However, the likelihood is that somebody might say no to that statement, and if they say no to that statement, they're saying no to all of those things. And the rates change but according to the channel. So if you on a page, you separated out email, phone, and postal mailing, in order of response rate, you probably get the highest response rate for email, then for postal mailings, and telephone would come right at the bottom. People really don't like being called when they're having their supper by somebody who they're not expecting the call from. So if you take telephone out of the equation, how many people actually use telephone for telephone marketing anyway? You know, in arts and cultural organisations, not so many. So really think about what you need to ask, be specific, and then just ask the things that enable me as Mr. Data Subject to give you permission to contact me in my preferred mode of communication, and you to gather the information that you need most effectively. And you can't make consent a condition of service. So you can't say, you can only buy this ticket if you join our marketing list. Okay, it has to be entirely optional. And you have to think about the logic as well in the way that you ask it. So this is quite a well-intentioned organisation who are saying, we really, really want to be specific now, so we're going to give you a big list of things that you can show that you're interested in, and we'll send you information on that stuff. However, they go, actually, are you interested in stuff that's for families? Are you interested in stuff that's for young people aged 13 to 25, or are you interested in art exhibitions? So what if I've said no to family stuff, and yes to art exhibitions? What if it's a family art exhibition, or the other way around, actually? What if it's no to activities for young people, but I've got an art exhibition that is for young people, but they've said no to art exhibitions? Can I then email those people? So the logic undoes itself. So ideally, you need to make the categories mutually exclusive. Does that make sense? Just to enable you to be completely clear about what you can use the information for, and that your audiences can be really clear about what they're wanting you to contact them about. Okay, how and where do you collect personal data? You really, really need to think about this, because you could be undoing some really, really good work. So these are just some different routes that organisations use. So who's got a ticketing system? Lots of people. Who also has a CRM system? Lots of people. Who does any kind of fundraising? Same hands going up again. Who does any kind of audience surveying? Some more hands going up again. Who uses MailChimp or DocMailer or any of those? So it's the same thing. So you're likely to have personal information in all of these places. Are they joined up? Are those systems joined up? Do you know that if I'm an audience member in your MailChimp system and in your ticketing system, do those two things know about the permission that I've given you to talk to me? You need to think about the customer journey and how and where people give permission. Because if, for example, you do everything squeaky clean on your ticketing system, and you say, you know, we would like to, really clear purpose, contact you by really clear channels, opt in, done the whole thing, know when people did it to, got the statement, can evidence the whole thing, really nicely collected. And then your fundraising team come along and go, hi, can we talk to you about fundraising? If I, as a data subject, go, well, I've already answered that question at the box office, I'm not going to answer it again, because you've got my permission already. So if I don't tick the box, what I've actually done could be construed as removing my permission, because you've asked me a question again, and I haven't given you an affirmative answer. So you have to think about who asks what questions at what point, so that you're not undoing the good work that you have. That might not be my intent, but it might be. I might go, no, actually I don't want to give you my permission now to talk to you about marketing. So even though the box office says you can, the fundraising team have subsequently asked it and you can't. So you need to have a system which goes, only the fundraising team ask at the points that they interact with people about fundraising for consent for them, and not the box office. Or you have a question which says, if our box office haven't already asked your permission for mailing for marketing purposes, can we contact you about da-da-da? So then you've kind of mitigated what's gone on already, or recognise that it has. So you need to think about who talks to your audiences and at what point, and how your data collection regime relates to it. Okay. I've already said you can't make tying up consent a condition of service. You can do this with Wi-Fi, though, because people don't have to use your Wi-Fi to access your services, and you can say to them, we offer free Wi-Fi. However, you've got to sign up to our mailing list. Would you like to do that? Tick here. So people have to opt in to it, and you can make it a condition of accessing the Wi-Fi service. But again, if you collect information in that way, you have to make sure that you're again not undoing things that you've already done through other permissions collection elsewhere. So one of the rights that people have, and this is another one that you'll need to think about, is how people withdraw their consent. And under GDPR, it has to be as easy to withdraw consent as it was to give in the first place. So if it's a tick box opt-in to give consent, it pretty much has to be a tick box opt-out or something similar to remove your consent, which you have the right to do at any point in time. So quite often, and in fact that very rarely is the case, because most places you get an unsubscribe button, and then you click on the unsubscribe button, and then it says log into your account, and you go, well, I haven't actually visited your organisation for 4 years, and I can't remember what my... So you then have to go and recover password, and then you have to go to your email, and then you have to find out what it was, and then you have to reset your password and come up with a new one, and then you log in and you redo your permissions, and that's just too convoluted. So for some people, that's your IT setup. You need to think about how you change that to make it much, much more easy for people to withdraw their consent. And you have to clearly notify people on every communication that you have with them that they have the right to withdraw their consent. And it has to be, good practice would be at the top of the communication, not buried in font size 4 at the bottom of it with an unsubscribe that you can't read that's in font grey. Does anybody come across that? You know, where is the unsubscribe? It is, it's kind of down there, right at the bottom, almost white, you can't find it. Don't do that, just tell people how they can exercise their rights. Simple, clear language we've already talked about, and this thing about reasonable expectations. I was talking to Richard earlier on. There's this fear about the 25th of May and the fact that the ICO are going to start driving around and imposing €4 million fines on people from that day forward, and we've all got to be completely compliant by that day or we're going to be in trouble. I would suggest that's very unlikely to be happening because the ICO don't have the resources to do that. The way that you will come to the attention of the ICO is if somebody makes a complaint against you. And people are most likely to make a complaint against you if you haven't thought about all of this stuff. So, informing people what you're doing and being absolutely transparent with them is entirely in your interest, because it's going to be the thing that stops you coming to the attention of the ICO in the first place. So just think about how you give people that right. And tell people, again, in your privacy notices and so on, tell people how they can exercise their rights. So our data controller is X, Y, and Z, and if you want to talk to us about your personal information, click here, and that will take people very quickly and easily to where they need to be. The performance of a contract, again, so we talked about consent being one basis for processing, legitimate interest being another one, but for a lot of organisations that sell tickets, performance of a contract means that if you're selling tickets online, you are in the course of a sale or the negotiation for a sale, you're capturing email address and name. There's an exemption to the Privacy and Electronic Communication Regulation that says you don't have to ask opt-in consent at that point. You can say, we would like to contact you about our events, tick here if you do not wish to, but only in the circumstance that you're selling tickets online and collecting that information anyway. And then somebody can read that very simple statement and say if they don't want you to. Now that is how a very large number of organisations operate around email address. It's okay to do that under the Privacy and Electronic Communication Regulation. But you're only allowed to contact people about the type of service that you're selling. So again, if somebody's buying a ticket for a show and they're giving you their consent, it's in relation to similar products and services. So you can't then talk to them about fundraising or education or outreach or anything else like that. It has to be about show marketing. And you have to subsequently always remind them that they have the right to opt out at any point in time. So if you're, as I say, there is that soft opt-in option, and you will get a higher response rate. So if you are selling tickets online and you can use a soft opt-in under those circumstances, more people are likely to join your lists as a result of doing that. What you can't do is use a soft opt-in for data sharing. because privacy electronic communication regulation, GDPR stipulates that you have to be clear about who the data is being shared with. And at that point, because it's a third-party organisation who they're not buying something from, PECA doesn't apply. So you actually have to get opt-in consent for data sharing for email, SMS, and automated telephone marketing. Okay. This is a lot of information that we're taking on, and it's going to be covered in further detail by colleagues talking after me, and there's options to ask questions during the panel bit as well. So don't feel like you have to take it all in. Okay. Automated processing. So this is another one which has kind of inspired fear and awe, which may not be as fearful as you need to be. So the Article 29 Working Party advice from the EU on automated processing makes quite clear the types of processing that you can and can't do, and when consent, explicit opt-in consent, is required from data subjects. And that is usually when the decision is entirely automated and it has a significant impact or legal effect on the data subject. So an example of that is I log on online to try and get a mortgage. I put in all my details, computer comes back, computer says no. Okay, so in that instance, the decision has been made by an algorithm somewhere that's taken all of my personal information, referred to some other information somewhere else, and come back and said no. This is what the impact of this law is designed to, this particular feature of the regulation is designed to protect, because under this, if you're doing that, you have to get permission in the first place to say that that's what you're doing. So if anybody's bought a phone or anything, you know, people will say, we're going to run a soft credit check on you. Is that okay for us to do that? Which is why they ask you that question. They have to have your consent, because it's going to have a significant impact on what the outcome of that is going to be. And if you say no, then the data subject has a right to have that decision reviewed by a human person. So that's what that's about. It's about giving people the redress to have it looked at, so that you don't get refused a mortgage or healthcare because of the postal code that you live in or something like that. Fully automated decisions with significant outcomes. For lots of organisations who append data to their records, so this could be wealth screening, it could be using Mosaic or Acorn or any of those kind of profiling tools, or adding third-party data or information you've got somewhere else to your audience's data records. You can do that if you follow the right steps. So you need to tell people that you're doing it and why you're doing it and what the outcome of doing it is. And in your privacy notice, you should tell people how they can object if they want to. So this is about your rights as an individual not to be subjected to. But as long as you're clear about what you're doing and you tell that to people, you can do it. Context specific, you need to go through the process of privacy impact assessment. What do we want to do? What information do we need? What's the result for the data subject? How do we mitigate any bad impact, and what's our legal basis for doing that in that circumstance? Can we do it? Yes or no? That's the process that you go through to arrive at those things. The right to be forgotten. I'd already said this is a right that people can do. This is likely to happen in lots of arts organisations when people don't want to be mailed by you. So the right to be forgotten is, again, the force of why this is coming about is to stop things like, I'm going to apply for a job. Prospective employer is going to Google search me online and see me very drunk somewhere on Facebook, half undressed and making a fool of myself. I don't want that to be on the internet anymore. I want it deleted because it's not, it's causing me distress and a negative impact. So this is what that kind of part of the legislation is designed to stop. Not, please don't mail me anymore. Because please don't mail me anymore can be answered by, okay, we'll suppress your record for more future. And as I said, you might have very legitimate reasons for retaining the record. If somebody's paid by credit card, you need that for audit purposes for a certain period of time to be able to demonstrate that. If it's gift aid, you might have very good reasons. If somebody says, I don't want you to mail me about stuff, and you delete their record and they come back in the next day and buy stuff again, and they don't explicitly say that to the next person who's on the counter, if you haven't still got their data that says, do not mail, then you can't not mail them if you've deleted their record. So actually there might be some process things that mean you really, really need to retain that record to fulfil the wishes of the data subject. So you kind of need to do that on a case-by-case assessment. Okay, that was a kind of whistle-stop gallop through those 8 things that I think most people are really, really going to need to think about. And they're kind of wrapped around by this idea of the fact that you need to be able to demonstrate accountability around these things and measure whether you can do them or not through these privacy impact assessments. So how on earth do we do all of that by the 25th of May? Where do you start? I'm sure colleagues to follow will suggest a similar approach, but just take a structured approach and start somewhere. If you haven't already, and I'm sure that many of you are already a long way along this road, and some of you may not be, but wherever you are, take a structured approach and just start. Just start doing it. Don't fear the size of the job. And I'd also suggest that, you know, the 25th of May, yes, that's when the law applies, but don't worry yourself into an early grave about getting all of this done by the 25th of May, because as long as you're working through it and you can demonstrate that you're working through it and you note the meetings that you've had and the decisions that have been made and the things that you've been thinking about, and you can evidence all of that and you're starting to document it, that will all help and go in your favour were you to come to the attention of the ICO and they were to investigate you. But obviously, the further down this route you can get, the better. And certainly in relation to the way that you use data, you absolutely have to be aware that things like consent, if you don't have the proper consent from that point forward, you've got to stop using it at that point until you've done all this and you know what you want to do with what data and that you've got a fair legal basis for doing it. So, do a personal data audit to start with. The first thing, where is the personal information in your organisation? Is it in a ticketing system? Is it in the CRM? Are those things joined up? Who has access to them? How do we make sure that those things sync? Have we collected a load of surveys that are sitting under somebody's desk somewhere on paper? And how long ago did we collect them? And do they need to be there? And you need to think about that carefully, really carefully. Because if somebody does a subject access request, which is another one of those enhanced rights that individuals have, you have to provide them with all of the information that your organisation has about that person. How do you know that you have that information about that person if it's sitting on a survey form with their name and address and email address on a piece of paper underneath someone's desk somewhere? If you're not going to use that information, what I would do is responsibly get rid of it as quickly as you possibly can, and just keep the information that you need for the purposes that you need to fulfil. Okay? So you really do have to do this thing about where's the personal information, who's got it, where's it sitting, do we need it, and what do we need it for? Then you go through a use audit. So in relation to the stuff that you've got, what do you want to use it for? Is it excessive to the purpose that you need to use it for? And are there bits of it that you can get rid of? If you're collecting telephone numbers but you never phone anybody, do you need those telephone numbers? Do you need to store them? If there was a breach, that's a bit of personal information that's out there in the public domain that, that shouldn't be anymore. So think about what you've got. You need to think about how things are stored securely. What security measures do you have in place to make sure that you don't have a breach, or that only the people that really need to access that information can? What policies have you got in place in the organisation? How do you transfer data between two people working next to each other? Do they put it on a data stick? What happens to that data stick at the end of the day when they go home? Is it in their pocket? Could it fall out on the train? Can you find a more secure way of doing that? And what's your policy to make sure that that doesn't happen as an organisation? So how do you secure your drives, and what are your policies for people working in process to make sure the data doesn't go anywhere where it shouldn't? And then this DPIA, Data Protection Impact Assessments, talked a lot about those. They're risk assessments. There's some really, really good information about how you do these things on the ICO's website. There's a document about conducting privacy impact assessments and the process that you can go through, and templates. If you haven't looked at the ICO's website, go and have a look. It's a fantastic resource that gives lots and lots of different booklets of information about lots of the things that we've been talking about. So there's one on consent, there's one on automated profiling, there's one on privacy impact assessments. There are videos that are really, really useful, and there's a phone number. You can ring the ICO up and ask them questions about stuff, because they now have a phone hotline. Then you need to have a process for systematically documenting all of this stuff. If you go to the Audience Agency's website and you search for GDPR, I've written a document that gives you a structure that you can work through this on. So if you haven't got an organisational data management policy, there's a document there that you can start to work through, and it kind of sets out the areas that you need to cover, and it's got this kind of, works through this kind of systematic process. And then the last point is go and talk to a lawyer. And I've put the last point there. You might want to talk to them earlier on, but don't ask them to do this work for you, because you're going to pay an awful lot of money for a lawyer to do that for you, and you won't have thought about all of the implications of everything yourself properly. So I would do the thinking yourself. How do you want to use the data? What data? Where's it stored? How do you secure it? How do you enable people to exercise their rights? You really need to think about all of those things as an organisation, and then have it reviewed by a lawyer, because you need somebody's sign-off to say, yep, this is fine, and then that gives you the confidence that you're doing the right thing. For example, the reason why you can't ask somebody else to just do this for you is how would you respond to a subject access request? Your lawyer doesn't know that. Your lawyer doesn't know where the data is in your organisation. How do you know if somebody's emailed you? How do you know if they've applied for a job? How do you know if they bought a ticket? How do you know if they've been surveyed? Lawyer doesn't know that. You need a policy that says these are the places where we've got our data, and if somebody asked us to evidence what we've got on them, this is how we draw that information together. These are the people that would need to be asked, and this is how we provide that information to the data subject.